Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, the podcast where we interview researchers to separate the science from the fiction in media coverage of psychology and mental health research. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health research scientist based at King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. Before we get started, I have a super exciting announcement that we're hosting our first Science or Fiction live. This is going to be a live podcast recording in London, and we'll also stream it online. We're going to be interviewing experts, both researchers and lived experience advocates, on self-diagnosing ADHD, getting into all the debate around social media, statistics, and everything in between. So it'll be on Monday, the 28th of October at the Science Gallery London in London Bridge. There'll be prizes, there'll be merch and nibbles if you come in person, or you can stream online and still send your questions in to the experts. All the information's on our website, scienceorfiction.co.uk, and I really hope to see you there. We'll be interviewing Shauna Campbell from ADHD Babes, and here's a quick message about what you can expect from their podcast.
ADHD Babes, the podcast.
Hosted by ADHD Babes members.
We release new episodes every 2 weeks on a Wednesday.
This isn't like other podcasts.
Nah, babes, this is new.
A podcast where we look into topics that directly affect Black women and non-binary people with ADHD. The podcast made by the community.
For the community.
I'm telling you, this is not to be missed.
You won't regret it.
Check it out. ADHD Babes, the podcast. Every 2 weeks on Wednesdays.
Okay, quick content warning and a reminder. In this episode, we discuss mental health issues in general, specifically anxiety and depression. If you're affected by any of the issues discussed, we've included resources on our website, scienceorfiction.co.uk. Also, just to note that we're not talking about individual cases of mental health and other issues. Instead, we're talking about the research in general and what the evidence shows. Okay, let's get into this week's episode. The debate as to whether young people should be using smartphones, how much they should use them, and what they should use them for is all over the media, and there's little consensus on what we should do. Some are calling for a smartphone ban. Author Jonathan Haidt has claimed smartphones should be banned for under 16s, but not all scientists agree. Digital health researcher Dr. Amy Orban has said this week that we're a digital society and children and young people have the right to be a part of it. Two studies published by researchers at King's College London have delved deeper into how young people feel about their smartphone use and how problematic smartphone use is related to mental health symptoms. What makes smartphone use problematic and how does it affect us? Is there evidence to suggest that we should ban smartphones for young people? So this week we're talking to Dr. Nikki Cork, author of the two studies in question and research and clinical lead at King's College London to answer these questions. So welcome, Nikki. It's great to have you here.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
First, before we get started, can you tell us a bit about what you do and how you got there?
Sure. So my day job is that I'm a consultant addiction psychiatrist. I work in a general hospital and I help people with substance addictions, so alcohol dependence, opiate dependence, and so on. And I got into studying problematic smartphone use about 6 years ago now, when I was introduced to my collaborator, Professor Ben Carter, and he asked me the question, are smartphones addictive? Now, as an addiction psychiatrist, that's a really interesting question, because at the time, in the addiction academic literature, there was a flat-out refusal to believe that smartphones could be addictive. And then in parallel, in the media, in the sort of popular media, it was definitely a thing. So as a clinician, as a scientist, I thought this was a really interesting question. And already in the sort of academic addictions field, we've been through a period of time where it had taken a good few years to recognize that gambling could be an addiction, that behaviors could be addictive. And then, the more recent thing is this recognition that video games for some people can be addictive. So smartphones are ubiquitous. And in my day job, I come across what happens when a behavior becomes so ubiquitous that the harms aren't really recognized. And that's, of course, alcohol. So I'm surrounded by people in their 40s dying as the result of their alcohol dependence. And then yet it's this thing that's not really talked about a lot in media. So, smartphones are relatively new. So I thought, well, this is an interesting question. So what Ben and I set out to do is to ask, what is the evidence that people have smartphone addiction? So that begs the question, well, how do we decide whether something's an addiction? And essentially, you need three different things about it that kind of characterize an addiction. The first thing is it needs to look a bit like a substance addiction or another behavioral addiction. So what makes something look like an addiction? Firstly, the people who are engaging in the behavior or using the substance have subjective loss of control over their use. So either they find that they're consistently using it for longer than they intended to initially, or, when they set boundaries for themselves and say, well, I'm only going to use, these days, these times, or I'm not going to use for a period of time, they struggle to stick to that. So that's the first thing which makes us think about that. The second thing that makes us think about that is what I would call primacy or salience. So that is where use of the substance or engagement in the behavior just takes over your life. So instead of doing things that are consistent with your values or your goals, instead of sleeping, you're engaging in that behavior. And also you're aware that some harmful things are happening. So the classic thing with alcohol is your doctor has said your liver's not so good, please stop. Okay. I guess with phones, it's things like sleep disruption, musculoskeletal pain in your thumbs, things like that. Mm-hmm. Or, an impact on your schoolwork. And then the last is tolerance or and withdrawal. So with addictive behaviors and addictive substances, you find that you need to do it for longer or use more to get the same sense of satiation or reward, and it becomes that it's really not enough. It feels like it's not enough, and it takes longer and longer for it to feel enough. You can see that, you can think potentially of people where you think, that describes their relationship to their smartphone, okay, but that's not enough.
It must be quite tricky with a smartphone though, because like a lot of people's jobs or everyday activities are also dependent on using it. So I'm thinking about point 2, where it's like it kind of takes over and it's like in every aspect of your life or whatever. It must be quite difficult to determine when that starts to become problematic, because if you need to use it for email and everything else or whatever you're doing on it, then where do we draw that line? That must be quite hard to define.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a subjectivity to it. I think, though, that it's the difference between purposeful activity that is aligned to your goals, right, and values. So, I make extensive use of maps on my phone. No matter how long I'm using a map on my phone, I can tell you that is a very helpful thing that is consistent with my values and goals. But, taking work email as an example, I held off having work email on my phone for a very long time. And recently, circumstances conspired such that I needed to. And I have definitely noticed that there are times when I'm checking my work email in a sort of reflexive way. It doesn't need to be done. This week being an example, I'm on annual leave. I do not need to be checking my work email. And there is a slightly automatic thing going on that's getting in the way a bit. I guess, I think there's, I think that particular behavior and the relationship to work and boundaries around work and norms around work is a sticky one. I think if you were planning to study and you found that you've been on TikTok or Instagram for 3 hours, it's a slightly more straightforward thing. But that's not enough, okay, to say, well, this is actually an addiction and it's actually something we need to look at and treat and fix. You need other things. So the first thing is that you need the behavior to persist over time. So for it to be slightly sticky, so if people are making goals and they want to change their use, then it's actually a little bit tricky for them. And then the third thing, finally, is that there does need to be a demonstrable association with harms. Okay, right. So you need there to be important consequences associated with this.
Okay, so that makes sense in terms of trying to identify an addiction. I think it's fascinating actually that you come at it from that. You've come towards this research from that perspective and with that knowledge. That's a really interesting way to look at it, and I think it helps to have like clear definitions that you would have based on like all the addiction research. So yeah, trying to identify whether it's an addiction or not. But then, so in that case, what does the term problematic smartphone use mean?
Okay, so it's the thing we call it because we feel it's too early to call it an addiction.
Right, okay.
And we want to distinguish it from screen time. Screen time, we argue, is one distinct exposure that is different from problematic smartphone use. So what we mean by problematic smartphone use is a cluster of behaviors and emotions and thoughts you have around your smartphone that superficially resemble an addiction. And what we did in 2019 is we looked at the state of the research literature on problematic smartphone use, broadly defined, across the globe in children and young people. And what we found was that people were using different tools to measure it. So part of the work we did is which of these tools maps onto most of the features of a behavioral addiction. And there is a clear sort of best tool, which is something called the Smartphone Addiction Scale, short version, that's been around for about a decade now. And we felt that mapped onto all the different constructs associated with addiction, the loss of control, the primacy, and the sort of tolerance, withdrawal phenomena. Now, what we found at the time was that the vast majority of the research did show an association with anxiety and depression in children and young people and poor sleep. The vast majority of the research was based in Southeast Asia, and the vast majority of the research was cross-sectional. And what I mean by that is that they measured people's problematic smartphone use and anxiety and depression, and this is all self-report, this is all general population samples, self-report, at the same time. And when you do that, it's not very easy to see which way the direction is going, and indeed whether there is a causal association. So that's where we were at that time. And one of the criticisms was, well, that there are these huge studies showing that screen time is not associated with harm. And I'm like, yeah, well, it wouldn't necessarily be because it's a different exposure. And the third thing was, this is a cultural phenomenon. This is a cultural phenomenon, and it's just going to be something in Southeast Asia. It's not going to be something in the UK. It's not relevant. And so this work that we've done is to try and address some of the problems with the research that we had encountered to date. So we've done a large survey of high school students, over 500 high school students throughout England, and we've looked at how many of them report problematic smartphone use and how that relates to depression and anxiety. Now, it was cross-sectional, and that was a pragmatic decision based on us not having research funding for this. But we wanted to just say, well, is it a thing in Britain? That was the first kind of thing we needed to do. And what we found was that about 18% self-reported problematic smartphone use.
Could you give an example of like a couple of the items that might be on the problematic smartphone use scale, just to get an idea of like what questions we ask?
So it's things like missing planned work because of smartphone use, having a hard time concentrating in class or while doing assignments or working because of smartphone use, feeling pain in your wrists and back of your neck because of smartphones. And then there are things about the emotional response, like wouldn't be able to stand not having a smartphone. I won't give it up even though my daily life is greatly affected by it, constantly checking it, and people telling me that I shouldn't use my smartphone as much.
Yeah, and then you end up like with a score and if it's high enough, it suggests that it's problematic. Okay.
And it is a scale, and it has a validated cutoff, but it is just a scale. It's just a way of saying, well, do people, how do people interact with their phone?
Mm-hmm.
And what we found is that if you endorsed, if you were above the cutoff for problematic smartphone use on this questionnaire, then you had a twofold odds of having moderate anxiety, and that's measured again by a self-report questionnaire, the GAD-7, which is the usual one that your GP would use to screen you for anxiety, and more than 3 times as likely to report depressed mood.
Yeah.
Now, there was no association between your reported screen time and anxiety and depression. So that was one of the things we looked at, is we wanted to separate those two things out. So that relationship with your phone was related, but screen time itself was not.
So it's when it starts to become like difficult to control, it seems, that there might start to be a problem. You mentioned that it's cross-sectional and at one time point at the moment, this research. So I'm guessing we can't really determine which way round the relationship is. We're not sure if higher anxiety, for example, leads you to go on your phone more and leads to problematic use, or whether the problematic use is leading to anxiety. Do we have any idea on that from in other parts of the research, or is it still quite early days?
So we've got another smaller study that we did in a slightly younger group. So that study, the study I've just told you about, was in 16 to 18-year-olds.
Yeah.
And then we did another study, which was in 13 to 16-year-olds. And that was a smaller study because 13 to 16-year-olds are harder to recruit for various reasons. So I think it was only about 60 people. We followed up over a month, and we did the SASSB, this problematic smartphone use questionnaire, and anxiety and depression questionnaires at 2 time points. And we looked at change over time. And essentially, it moves us a little bit further on because it suggests that as one changes, the other changes. So as your PSU increases, your anxiety increases. As your PSU increases, your depression increases. But again, it doesn't really tell you what's driving that association. Now, this is not uncommon with addictions, actually. There's something called the self-medication hypothesis, which is that you engage in addictive behaviors as a way of avoiding whatever is going on for you that's difficult emotionally. Commonly, what happens is that becomes a bit of a vicious cycle, because that behavior that takes you away from whatever's bothering you also takes you away from the sorts of things that make people happy, and able to heal from the slings and arrows of life, which is meaningful activity, connection, face-to-face connections with friends and families, adequate sleep, exercise, these sorts of things. And the problem with any behavior that has a potential to become addictive is that it gets in the way of all of that stuff. It gets in the way of problem solving. So yes, we're not a great deal further along. But it's not a surprising development, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's still, the separation between screen time and problematic smartphone use is still really helpful, because it kind of goes back to my first question about how a lot of our lives are just embedded into having to use smartphone use or computers or whatever. So I think for me, that screen time versus problematic smartphone use kind of suggests that if you are using it in a way that you're kind of in control of, and it's not getting carried away, it's not getting out of control for you, then it can be either neutral or positive.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's something. So our second study was a mixed method study. So we didn't just get quantitative information. We also asked open questions to the teenagers. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And they were very clear that it helps them keep in touch with friends and family who might be all around the world, and it helps them with their schoolwork. We need to remember that for some teenagers, their phone is their access to the internet. That is how they look stuff up. Some of them even write essays on their phone. That might be the only resource they have. So they're very clear that it's helpful for that, and that it's a source of entertainment. However, one of the things that I really love about the research findings is that teenagers have a very sophisticated appreciation of the pros and cons of their phones. So they were saying, well, it's great. And if I'm bored and there's nothing to do in the holidays, I can't see any problem with spending lots of time on it. However, what are the downsides? Well, it does get in the way of my schoolwork. Sometimes it makes my mood worse. It does get in the way of me pursuing my hobbies, of spending time with friends and families. They were very clear about that. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is that most of them were using some kind of strategy to control their use. I think that is really interesting.
I think that's such an important finding in this debate, because the more and more chat there is about, we need to ban phones at school, we need to ban phones in under 16-year-olds in the media, it's just not helpful. And I think, yeah, I agree that this is a really important finding, because it's showing that young people are very aware of their behavior and their smartphone use. And like you said, I think I pulled out a couple of quotes from your interviews where someone said, for example, I deleted TikTok a few months ago and my quality of life improved. So they have really good insight into this use, and they're using these strategies, which is really important.
I think so. And they also had a clear idea of what helped and what didn't help. So one of the things we asked them is that, what strategies do you use? And we asked them to rate them, from, not very effective. I mean, this is sort of basic stuff. It's not very sophisticated research. What's very effective, what's not effective, these sorts of things. The three most effective were using the do not disturb function, turning off all notifications, and keeping the smartphone in another room at bedtime. And it's actionable. What's also interesting is a couple of years ago, we did the same with a larger sample of university students, and it's the same three.
Mm-hmm.
So there's real consistency in what people find. And then there's some things that we were expecting them to find helpful, like making it grayscale, which didn't work at all.
Is that just taking the color away?
Yes. So there was this theory that it makes it more attractive if it's colored, and if you make a grayscale, then that's going to make it less attractive to you. But actually, it's the notifications. And you're a psychologist, and you will know all about unpredictable reinforcement. So notifications are going to be the thing, right? They're going to be that little prod. There's a reward coming, and it's a bit unpredictable when they come, and that's going to be the hook for behavior. So it's not a surprise. And I don't work with teenagers. I'm an adult psychiatrist. I work with adults. So I have to caveat all of that with this, because I'm not a subject expert in that sense. But I have long experience in helping people change their behavior. And all the evidence that we have is that telling people to do stuff is associated with a persistence of that behavior. And so what I would be encouraging anybody who's worried about their partner, child, etc., smartphone use is to engage in a bit of a dialogue about it, acknowledging both the pros and the cons, and trying to find what that person's reasons for changing their use might be. It's always going to be more powerful than the reasons that you think they should change their use.
And maybe that could be effective even like within schools, like having those conversations of like how might it be useful to have maybe phones available sometimes and not at other times, but having a conversation with students or young people instead of just like making a universal decision that's going to affect everyone that might not be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing about universal decisions is that one of the issues that Jonathan Haidt does talk about, which I think is a good thing to bring up, is something called the collective action problem. That one of the issues with limiting smartphone use is that it involves a certain amount of social exclusion if other people's parents aren't limiting their smartphone use. Mm-hmm. So the one the one nice thing about blanket rules at school level, for example, is that it means that everybody's subject to the same circumstance. Does that make sense? So nobody's being socially excluded, because that's what one worries about, right?
It's just really tricky though, isn't it? Because like we were saying earlier, smartphone use will be different and will need to be different for different people. Like if your smartphone is your only resource to do your homework on, or potentially like some of the research has shown, if you're part of a marginalized group or if you have sensory issues or something, like your smartphone use, that's very different to another person.
It really is tricky. And I think this is why it's so important that young people are part of this conversation.
Yeah, 100%.
I think in part because we don't fully understand, we can't fully understand what it is like for them right now at their developmental stage. I'm too far away from it. And also because it has to be meaningful to them. Whenever you're trying to get someone to make healthy changes, it's got to be, you can't know the circumstances of their life. I mean, you've made a great point. What about marginalized people? What about people with sensory needs?
But I think this point of like kind of centering young people's voices is so important, because what they're going through now with like this digital world and smartphone use, like how the world works right now was not the same even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, with like ChatGPT coming out. So we have to listen and to work with the voices who are actually using it for the first time right now.
Absolutely. I think there's something else to talk about, which is, is the smartphone itself addictive? Or is it a delivery device? So is it the heroin or is it the needle? And I think that is a question, and my suspicion is that actually on a smartphone, and there's some economists in the States that have looked at this using maps as a control, because it's not very common to get really, really, really stuck on the maps, that there are certain apps that probably are addictive, and there are probably some other things that probably aren't, and we can relax about. And I suppose I would say, if you think that, in gambling, there's this idea about variable reinforcement. So once upon a time, there was a behavioral psychologist who tried to get a pigeon to push a lever. And if you put a pigeon in front of a lever and you give it a treat every time it pushes the lever, the pigeon does not keep pushing the lever. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but the young people listening might not know this. But if you give the pigeon a treat every second time they push the lever, they still won't persist in pushing the lever. But if you vary the number of pushes you need to get that treat, that pigeon will keep going. And it's a sort of principle behind the one-armed bandits in betting shops, those things where you pull the lever and the fruit come up, and then you may or may not get a cash reward. And if you think about certain apps, there is this sense that you're scrolling through and you see something interesting and rewarding, and you're scrolling through and you kind of don't know when something fun is going to turn up. And similarly, say you're creating content, you're creating a video, you're putting a picture up, you don't know the number of likes you're going to get or the comments, and sometimes you get loads and sometimes you don't get anything, and that kind of thing, we know that causes behavior to persist. So I guess what I would say to young people is, be savvy, recognize that your aims and your goals are not necessarily completely aligned with the aims and goals of the companies that produce these apps. What is going to motivate them? What motivates them is profit for their shareholders, which means exposure to advertising content, which means the amount of time you spend on that particular app. And thus, you know, you need to be a bit skeptical about what's going on, you know, and whether it's in your interests.
Yeah, which can be really hard to do, but I think it's a really important point. And something that we can keep in mind whilst we're using them, I guess. What I try to do sometimes is to like, because it's really hard when you're using an app to have that level of like understanding of like, am I looking at it for these reasons, or am I looking at it for the reasons that the app wants me to look at it? So I try sometimes to delete an app or a couple of apps for a few days and just see how I feel. See if I feel like, am I missing anything? What was I actually using it for? How long was I using it? Is it actually useful? Did I talk to my friends on it, or did I just watch random stuff? Like, and it's not until I've kind of taken it off my phone that it kind of like opens up some space in my mind to have those thoughts.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing is you'll recognize, oh my goodness, I've picked up my phone 7 times to look for this app, before realizing that it's not there,
not there anymore.
But it's become so automatic for me to do that. I think that's brilliant, you know, and I would certainly recommend that. I would recommend, you know, writing a bit of a diary of, you know, when am I using, you know, if I'm starting to have a niggle about the app, or maybe my mum's on my back or whatever, I'd want to keep a little bit of a diary where like, how long am I actually spending on this app? You know, is there any truth to that? And how do I feel before? How do I feel afterwards?
Yeah.
You know, is it a net benefit, or is it actually making me feel more wound up than I otherwise would be? And as you say, delete them for a period of time. You know, see how it feels. Why not?
That's really helpful, especially because we've mentioned the strategies that the young people talked about, like having like do not disturb, turning notifications off, and considering what social media apps, for example, are doing to kind of keep us on there and trying to be a bit more aware of our like viewing time and our behaviors. What's next in terms of your research in this area? Are you planning kind of like a follow-up study, or have you thought about that yet?
I think I would love to do a more rigorous longitudinal study looking at people who fulfilled criteria for problematic smartphone use and those that don't at baseline, and then following them up to see who develops anxiety and depression over time, or whether there are differences in educational attainment. I'm quite interested about smartphone use in neurodiverse populations. You know, there's a lot of chat about how people with ADHD might be more vulnerable to a problematic smartphone use. They certainly are more vulnerable to other addictions. So I'm interested in that. I think with autistic people, I think there's a real question there about smartphones being in some ways really beneficial in terms of rendering social communication less ambiguous. I think those are interesting things. And then we also want to develop a workshop for schools that we can go in and give on a sort of class-wide basis that's essentially just talking through these issues and see whether it makes a difference to people. There's one other thing which which we haven't covered, which I think it's important to just mention.
Okay.
Which is that when we've discussed problematic smartphone use, it's not the only thing that we think about with smartphones. So there are issues to do with body image in girls. There are issues to do with online safety. Those are separate issues. Then on the latter point, the online safety point, there's a dearth of research on what actually helps keep children safe. That's not my area. You know, I'm very much an addiction psychiatrist. I look at addictions. But I think that's a very disquieting area and something that really needs research. So that's just one thing I would say, you know, in all my conversations about, well, how do we speak to young people? That's a problem that I really am not sure how to manage.
Yeah, I think that's really important here, is that what we're specifically talking about is like problematic behaviors with smartphones, as opposed to those other huge issues that are definitely embedded.
But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm not saying, you know, everything's hunky dory. We just need to help the minority who are having a bit of a difficult relationship. I think there are numerous issues.
Yeah.
This is one. This is one little issue.
One part of it. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Just before we finish, do you have any recommendations for listeners if they want to find out more about this topic?
I think there's a lot written about this topic. I would recommend a website called The Conversation, which is helpful because it has articles written by scientists about their work that just has the opportunity, gives scientists the opportunity to explain things in more detail, so you can understand what they're saying and what they're not saying. One of the issues with the mainstream media is making sure that what you're saying is not misreported. I mean, we try quite carefully to be very clear that this is something that is starting to look a little bit like an addiction, but we're not calling it addiction yet because we don't have the weight of evidence.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always come across in a sort of 200-word article or whatever.
Exactly.
So I'd recommend The Conversation because it goes into these things at length.
This is exactly why we make these podcast episodes, so that if someone sees a news article that seems a little bit dramatic, let's say, they can come to an episode like this and get into a little bit more of the detail and try and understand, like, what does the evidence actually show and what do we really know about this topic. So thanks so much for coming on today. Like, you really cleared up a lot of kind of misunderstanding or lack of understanding I had about smartphone use, whether it's problematic, what kind of strategies we can use, and I think this will be a really helpful episode.
Great. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Lovely to chat.
Thanks for listening, and thanks again to Nikki Cork for coming onto the podcast today. We've moved over to Substack, which means it's much easier to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, and you can also listen to the podcast on there, and you'll find links to the research that we discuss and recommendations from the researcher and links to free mental health support should you wish to look it up. So that's at scienceorfiction.co.uk. Make sure you subscribe this month because we're going to launch information about our first Science or Fiction Live. You can follow us for updates and more information on Instagram and TikTok at Science or Fiction Pod, or on X at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or you have a suggestion for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. Thank you to the youth advisory groups for their input on this series, and to Kit Studio for the branding and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.